Let's see what we can get through today. I've got a plan A and a plan B. We may be able to do both of them. I guess I mean the thrust of the last two chapters in the book is, as Graham Hall himself admits, he doesn't actually talk much about methods in the last two chapters. It's almost he's kind of sort of moved on, having kind of dismissed the method, not dismissed, but problematized the method concept and positioned himself in a sort of post-method era. The choices facing teachers and curriculum designers, etc., and materials writers for that matter, is less about which method are we going to use, but more about the individual activities and materials from which we build our kind of eclectic principled approach. Hi, Fazlul. So
I'm late. Sorry for being late.
No, you're not late at all. We're just a bit early. So what I want to sort of look at then is what I guess it's also following on from the last session about the principles underpinning our practice. To look at how we choose activities. What criteria do we use? And this sort of relates again to the question I posted in the discussion, what about how do teachers answer the question, why did you do that? What is the rationale? What are the principles, if any? And that generated some very interesting ideas about, for example, I do that because I've done it before and it works, because the students like it. I mean, I'm not saying that these reasons are not valid. They may need to be examined and challenged. Just because you've done something in the past and it's worked doesn't mean to say it's going to work now in this particular context. Just because the students like it doesn't mean to say that it's good for them. I remember with a group of teenagers I had, one of the things they loved was watching videos in class, and I mean, thought that's not really a very useful, productive use of classroom time, especially when they can watch them, in their own time, etc. I guess they liked the fact that it was passive, enjoyable, and hopefully that they were helped to understand what was going on. But I mean, it didn't seem to be, when you ask teenagers what it is they want to do in class, you've got to be very skeptical about their answers. So what I want to look at is this notion of activity, and looking at a couple of activities that have been around for a very long time. Now, you may know this word game. It's now not considered politically correct to call it hangman, and there's various versions of it. Basically, what the students have to do is guess a word by supplying letters, and they have a limited number of turns before they are out. And you do this as a whole class activity, or the students can do it in pairs, etc. And I know, I mean, teachers love this. I remember when I was teaching here in Barcelona in the institution I was in, that many teachers would begin a lesson with a hangman. It was a kind of way of getting students focused and introducing a topic. For example, so if the topic's going to be nutrition, then that would be the word that they would be required to guess. But it's also, of course, used as a way of revising vocabulary that's been previously taught. I had suspicions about this activity, I must admit, uh, irrespective of the name, however you rename it or redesign it. But I wasn't 100% convinced, as many of my colleagues were, that this was a great thing to do. And it wasn't until I was working with Penny on a book that, the third edition of a book that she's famous for, A Course in English Language Teaching, that I listened to her talk about this activity. And in fact, she uses it in the book. She has a list of activities. She asks the readers to evaluate them, and then she has her feedback. And this is what she said. Apologize for the length of the quote, but I'll just let you read. This is what her take on hangman was. And there's an example where the target word is journal. Okay, so you get the idea that she doesn't approve of this activity in any way and thinks it's a monumental waste of time, although it is superficially attractive. It's motivating and fun for both students and teachers. And this really made me think, yeah, James.
Yeah, she says that it contributes little or nothing to engagement with the target language feature, but that's only one reason to do the activity, okay? There might be others, and also, for example, the example you gave of introducing a new topic, that would be a kind of a fun way in to introduce a new word in a way that's, I think the emotional side of it, or maybe setting the tone of the lesson or something like that, would outweigh the negative aspects that Penny here is talking about.
Okay, exactly. So, I mean, for any activity, there are cognitive features, if you like. There are also affective features, emotional features. Uh, and for anything we do in the classroom could be for a number of different purposes. This, she would argue, has no sort of learning payoff. But in terms of your point, James, in terms of a different kind of engagement, an effective engagement, if you like, it may have some value. I mean, I think, and like as I said to Elaine in the forum, I think anything that you do repeatedly to the point that you forget why you're doing it can become a ritual rather than a routine, a useful routine. So, and I think the teachers that I was working with, many of them were using this as a sort of in a ritualized way. But I certainly take your point. Around about the same time as all these teachers in my institution were using Hangman to begin their lessons, there was also a phrase for doing this kind of activity. Do you recognize it? It's called a running dictation. So a running dictation is basically you have a text. You have students in groups. You have a text. The text is somewhere else where the students are not. In this picture, you can see it's on the floor. It's in the book on the left there. And what the students have got to do is taking turns is to memorize as much as they can of the text, rush back to their group, tell the group what they've memorized, who write it down until they've got the whole text written down. So it's like a dictation, except it's not a dictation as such. It's a reconstruction of a written text. They're not hearing it read to them. They're seeing it and they're holding it in their kind of immediate working memory long enough to be able to return to their colleagues And I've seen this done in a number of ways, with the text is put outside the classroom, so the students are rushing in and out of the classroom dangerously, or the text or different texts of about the same length are around the walls of the classroom, and different groups are assigned to different texts. And then an interesting follow-up is then they have to read the 3 texts, let's say, and then put them in order. There may be 3 parts of a story, for example. So there's ways of following this on. I was extremely suspicious about this, I have to say, though, because it seemed to me to be a bit of a fad, if you like, a fashion that caught on, and it kind of, okay, so again, coming back to James's point, I mean, they're running around, there's a certain competitive excitement to the whole thing, but I wasn't 100% convinced that it had, a bit like Penny and Hangman, I wasn't convinced that there was bang for the buck. That is to say, that there were learning consequences from all the kind of work that went into doing it and setting it up, and the pandemonium of the students running, especially young one. When we were putting together this book, which came out early this year or late last year, so this is a Cambridge handbook called 100 Great Activities. Penny and I co-edited it, and basically it's a collection of activities from the various handbooks in the series, in the Cambridge series. There are almost 50 of them, and we decided it was time to collate. So writers of the books were encouraged to submit their favorite activity from the book that they had written. And one of them, of course, was running dictation. And the writer of the book in which this first appeared in the series, where all the writers were asked to provide a reason why they liked the activity. And then the editors commented on the activity as well. So this is Jenny Goose in Australia. It comes from a book, Communicative Activities for English as EAP, English as a what?
Academic purposes.
Yes,
English for
right.
academic purposes.
Thank you. I had a momentary blackout there. So groups raised a completed text. And so the author's comment is, it literally got my students out of their seats. This lively activity is a winner on several fronts. A welcome break from sitting at desks. It promotes communication in an energized classroom setting that caters for both weaker and stronger learners. It can be adapted to all abilities and timeframes, blah, blah, blah. Vocabulary and grammar from the dictation provide a great base for delayed error. So again, I emphasize it's not a dictation in any traditional sense. And then the editors, that's me and Penny, were invited to comment on each of the activities in the book. And I can't remember if this is me or Penny, but we said, yeah, this is so adaptable to level, to topic, to text type, to target language feature. And it really does require multiple levels of processing, from spelling all the way through to textual cohesion and coherence. So in other words, what the person has to remember when they read the text, they've got to hold in their memory the bits of the text that their memory or their attention span allows, which is limited, as we all know, 7 pieces of information. So they've got to process, as they do in an ordinary dictation, you've got to process the input. They've got to hold it there long enough to get back to their group, and then they've got to decode it to the group, and the group then has to write it down. So it does involve spelling, it does involve grammar and vocabulary, it involves textual cohesion and coherence, and so on. So multiple levels of processing, which is what dictations actually do, old-fashioned dictations, or particularly dictogloss. As a follow-up, I suggest you might like to ask the students at a later date if they can still recall the text well enough to reconstruct it. Do this in groups, then there's a whole class activity, one student at the board acting as the class secretary. So I'm actually quite uncritical of it, although I had my suspicions in the old days, but I had to take this teacher's or this writer's assessment of the activity in good faith, and think of ways, that justify the activity. And I think, like all text reconstruction activities, it works at various levels of processing. Has the added element, it gets the students up off their seats. And it's competitive, which could be a good thing or a bad thing. But it's certainly it's an activity that's probably great for certain kinds of learners, particularly younger learners. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the activities that, particularly these kind of iconic activities, the activities that have been around for ages and now are kind of collated into books like this, are not always great. I mean, they've just been handed down over the years, uncritically perhaps. We need, as principled eclectic teachers, we need perhaps to kind of put on our crap detectors to unpack them and to challenge whatever assumptions they are based on. So that's what I want to do now in the groups. I want you to think about these 3 questions. Describe one of your favorite classroom activities, and you can describe Hangman if you like, if you really want to stick to it. But something that you do a lot because of whatever reason, yeah? Why you like it, and then decide what characterizes a good language learning activity. In a sense, we've kind of covered perhaps already some of the criteria of what makes a good language learning activity. Okay, so I'll just take that away. Do I need to put that into the let me just copy that. Oop, 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 oop. Let me just copy that and put it into the chart, those 3 questions. But really, it's just a show and tell, if you like, of activities that you love to do. And at least if one person, everybody can think of one, and then when you run out, if you've still got time, then think of some more. So I'll just put those into the chat. And how many are we today? We are 11, 10. Thank you, James. So 3 groups. Let's say we go 1, 2, 3. Let's see if this works. There you go. I'll give you about 10, 15 minutes on this. Hi, Saba. Saba, are you frozen? Oh, there she goes. Okay. Right, here we are. We lost Fazlul, and I think his connection is no good. So, okay. So, with what would you like to share from your discussion, particularly in reference to the 3rd question, which is what characterizes a good class activity? But if there's activities that you heard that you hadn't heard before that you think we all ought to know about, then please share them.
Okay, I'm gonna share. I was talking about I I started including TikTok videos in my lessons, and I do that because, of course, because I think most of my students watch TikTok anyways, and they're short, like a minute or two, and I of course choose appropriately, level, context, whatnot. And then sometimes I have them retell the story to me with their own words. Sometimes I have them transcribe it. Sometimes I have them transcribe it and pick 5 words to retell the story, appropriating the language. And now I'm even making them justify why they chose those words or expression. Why is it appropriate? Uh, in the hopes that they would notice and then internalize, borrow the language, whatever. So that's something I do.
Thank you, Deborah. Yes, and I made the point when I was in your room, breakout room, that the advantage, of course, being that they're short, unlike a full-length feature movie, which is what my teenagers wanted to watch. But also, it's in a sense less an activity; it's a resource for which generates a number of different kinds of activities, including, as you say, transcribing, but also narrating, recalling, and narrating, etc. So it's a springboard into productive activities, which seems to me a really good use of that kind of resource.
And if I could add why I think it might be effective or a good activity, I think it's because I never really know if they are learning what I'm teaching per se, you know. So I feel like sometimes they pick up things in the lesson that's not really what I'm targeting. So I try to create rich environments, like rich inputs, where they hopefully would notice what I'm trying to nudge them to do, but also they will have plenty of opportunities to pick up on other things. So because if it's just simplistic, if the material is very narrow, that kind of like, I tend to run away from that and try to create a richer. So that's why I think that's a good thing.
Okay, great. Thanks, Deborah. Anybody else? Fazlul, welcome
Well,
back.
I
Sorry,
didn't talk about this in my group, but for teenagers, I use music lyrics uh, for the 15 minutes or maybe 30 minutes of the class. And that's because they're not into talking that much and they don't like reading and they're at the age where they're teenagers. They're not children anymore. When you play a game with them, they kind of get offended at some point that we're not children anymore. And when you want to work with them like adults, they're like, that's too much for us. So I use the music lyrics, and that's something that they enjoy, and they know that's their routine for next week. So they're gonna find some music for themselves for a whole week and come and talk about it in the class. And sometimes we bring the lyrics and we even talk about it, some words, or sometimes we try to make debate out of it. That's what I find useful. But again, it depends on a person. For some students, it worked. For some, it was a disaster, a complete disaster. But with that, again, I engage the student in a way that they enjoy coming to class, and I find some relevant subjects to work with them. And unbelievably, they find some very hard words and they learn it spontaneously. And they surprise me at that point. And yeah, I think that the first job of a teacher is communication. We have to make them confident in their own language and also find the words that they need and somehow make language learning process much easier path because
Mhm,
it looks difficult for all of them and they feel like ah it's mathematics, I don't like it. So I
mhm,
want to make that as a powerful notion for them, it's easy, they can just handle it, they can just embrace
mhm,
it. So that's something that worked with teenagers, but again for adults I told in the class that gaming is impossible because they're adults and they feel like I came here for a lecture and I paid you for something. You have to give me give me that vocab or grammar at the end of the day. And at some point I'm like, okay, let's do this. They're looking for some kind of a lecture. So I do 15 minutes round of speaking for about whatever they like. And based on that, we continue the class and we teach the grammar based on what context that they bring. Yeah, that's mine.
Thanks, Summer. And it's interesting that both you and Deborah focus on resources which provide input. And we've seen already, I mean, in the chapter, Graham Hall identifies as one principle of any learning theory that is now current, is that you need input, but not just input. And that in both your cases, you use the input as a springboard to output, whether it's speaking or writing or whatever, because input on its own doesn't seem to be sufficient, despite what Krashen says. Good, excellent, lovely. Anything else? Any other favorite activities or any other criteria for a good classroom activity?
Yeah, I could quick recap what our group talked about for the third question. We thought that the criteria for good language learning activities would be, first of all, that it's significant to the learner. What you're talking about or what you're doing has some sort of personal significance to them. Secondly, that there's interaction involved, that students are interacting with one another. And thirdly, that there's an output on the end of it, that that it doesn't just sort of float away. Okay, we talked about that, we're all done, but they have the task of writing something, preferably writing, but they could, of course, record something, but they capture what they've done in one form or another. For further, it could be analyzed later then by them or by the teacher or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that point. And actually, it came up in the discussion forum. I can't remember which one or why, but it was in reference to how sometimes we do the right thing for the wrong reason, or we do the wrong thing for the right reason. And I think the example of the latter would be an activity which is like a group work discussion that's done for the right reason, which is to get students interacting and communicating, but it's done in such a way that there's no outcome, and therefore it sort of doesn't go anywhere. And I think this is often my experience is observing classes, particularly in the early days of the communicative approach. A lot of teachers felt, oh, it's just enough for students to be sitting in groups talking to each other. But actually, if you eavesdrop those group discussions, you realize that they're at the lowest possible level of kind of engagement. I mean, people are just, it's like a car that's, you can hear the engine running, but it's in neutral. It's not going anywhere. It's idling. And so where's the push? And I think one way of providing the push is to have an output that they know it's pre-selected, and they're going to have to report, for example, to the rest of the class on the discussion. And that the backwash effect of knowing that they're going to have to report, maybe even stand up and report, hopefully motivates them to pay attention during the activity, and also to kind of tidy up the language. So, think about the language, the formalizing the language, because they're going to have to use that language to report to the rest of the class. Deborah.
I read a LinkedIn article once. I don't remember who was it from or whatever, but I know that it was about the difference of teaching, practicing, speaking versus teaching a language, right? So instead of we're teaching content, vocabulary, whatever, grammar, we're actually facilitating the practice of speaking English, or the fluency per se. And that intrigues me because I was thinking, there is no output per se, there's no push, like I'm just letting you practice. But that's important, isn't it? You have to practice. If I'm just like constantly getting you to do things, so would you see that as an activity Or would that be a different category of practicing what you already know, or fluency focused?
Well, I mean, definitely, students talking to each other about whatever and all the different kinds of, I mean, that would be a generic activity, I guess. And you can, I mean, the whole literature on task-based learning, for example, has a classifies speaking tasks and writing tasks into different subgroups, so that you often depending on their outcome, whether it's a task which has is divergent or convergent. No, divergent or convergent. So a divergent task has no particular outcome. People just giving their opinions, for example, about an issue, like, for example, banning cars from the center of cities. What they feel a convergent task, on the other hand, is one where they have got to reach a consensus or a decision, and then presumably report that to the rest of the class. And it's been shown that the convergent task produce, on the whole, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the research suggests that they produce a sort of better quality of language and engagement than divergent tasks. So it's not yes, it's coming back to James's point. It seems to be important that whatever the speaking task, or the writing task for that matter, it has a purpose, an outcome, and perhaps some kind of follow-up. And the same would be said for, for writing tasks too, for that matter, but also for receptive skills tasks, for listening and reading. There's not just read the chapter of this book, or read this poem, or read this newspaper article. Where there's something needs to be done with that to kind of raise the ante, as it were, to provide a little extra challenge. And of course, that relates to the Merrill Swain's concept of pushed output, that learners need to be pushed when they're speaking, for example, to produce language which is a little bit beyond or above their current sort of comfort level, which might mean just simply saying, well, that was great. Somebody reports what, their opinion about whatever. Now do it again, but this time see if you can do it more fluently, or if you can do it with fewer errors, or if you can do it in a shorter time. And those kinds of activities which push learners to go beyond their current competence a little. What she calls output plus one, analogous to input plus one. So yes, so it's, in a sense, it's not the activity type, it's what you do with the activity type. What kind of push or challenge you can add to the activity type to make it a little bit more demanding, a little bit more not so demanding that it over challenges learners, but that it pushes them to go a little bit beyond their current level of competence. I'm not sure if that answered your question, Deborah. If it was a question, just say, sorry.
Yes. I was thinking while I was reading the chapter that even though we talk about input and output, of course, both are important. And again, we can come back to the aspect of criteria in relation to how much input we should use, or how much output but since we're asking, or our mission is to make students use the language, of course, output seems to be what we're looking for. And as you said, we want to push them to do it. But I feel that there is a strong relationship between reading and writing, since they are the productive skills. So, and I also, at least based on my experience, I also think it's important to rehearse some things. So I think writing before speaking is usually a good technique or strategy, So we give them some time to organize their thoughts, and so they're, in a way, they are rehearsing in order to be able to do to express what they were thinking. I don't know what you think about that, but I mean, you all, but I believe that very few people, and I don't know if this is based on research or anything, it's maybe very empirical in my case, but I think very few people can say what they cannot write. If they're able to write, they're able to say it. So I think that that's why I prefer, for example, one of my criteria would be, if I want them to, of course, not all the time, but if I want them to talk about what they have discussed, I usually give them some time to write things down, even if it's not a text or just notes, but they're rehearsing what they're going to be saying.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think, again, research, I can't quote any specifically, research suggests that where there's rehearsal time built into a task, but it needn't be writing. It could be spoken rehearsal, but spoken rehearsal in pairs or groups before they then perform to the class, you know, just as an actor rehearses their lines. But any kind of rehearsal usually has increments in terms of the quality of the final task. It's going to be more fluent, it's going to be more accurate, maybe even more complex. So, but yeah, right. I mean, one of my favorite activities, while we're on the subject of favorite activities, is this activity I call paper conversation, which is where at the beginning of the class, typically with the learner, instead of having a chat in groups or pairs about whatever, they have a written chat, so as if they were texting each other, but it's one piece of paper that goes backwards and forwards between the two students or three students or whatever, and they just have a conversation about whatever they want. But because it's written, there's a bit of a lag. It slows it down a little bit, so it gives it a little bit of thinking time. And also because it's written, it's available for the teacher to go around and say, "Ah, yeah, that's a nice expression," or "This is what you could say here." But when they're just chatting, spoken, oral chatting, it's very difficult to capture everything that's going on. But of course, then having done that, having had their conversation about the weekend or whatever in this paper conversation, you can then say to them, "Okay, turn it over, put it aside, see what you can remember, see what you can do now without, you know, orally." So using the written stages, as you say, as a kind of rehearsal stage. But yeah, absolutely. But also, anyway, task repetition, however it's done, has been shown to have positive effects on performance. When the students do the same task again, they're always better. The question is, of course, how can we persuade them to do the task again without them feeling, well, no, I've just done this. So it may be as simple as just changing partners. Okay, any kata? Wicket, yes. So I mean, yeah, I mean, you repeat the task. You did it initially in writing. Now you're going to do it in reading, in speaking.
Different partner,
That's way
different setting, different topic, whatever you can do.
Absolutely, yeah. Or give them a time limit or whatever. Yeah. Okay, I just want to share, when we were putting this book together, there's 100 great activities. We had all these activities. We still had to make a selection, and therefore we needed criteria. And that really made me think, what are the criteria for a good language learning activity, which was the second question I asked you. Okay, so let's just go back. Let me share with the criteria that we came up with and we put into the introduction of the book, and see, well, if you have any questions or queries. I mean, so this comes back to this comes up in Graham Hall's book again and again, because it's that concept which was first really promoted by N.S. Prabhu in a paper called Why There Is No Best Method. I think, James, I'm sure it's in the archive. And he uses this notion of plausibility and what's sometimes called face validity, particularly with regard to testing, but does it seem valid? So the question then is, does the activity seem plausible to teachers? Does it match teachers' professional judgments as to what works in the classroom? Likewise, from the learner's point of view, does the activity seem something worth doing? I mean, because, it may seem plausible to the teacher, but if the learners don't see any point in it, like running dictation, for example, then it's not going to work. So that was one of our criteria. Just even if you don't like the activity, I mean, but is it plausible? Well, very importantly, and this really relates to the content of this chapter, how rich is the activity in terms of the amount of language practice it provides. So this is the payoff. So whereas, Penny Ehr's criticism of Hangman is it doesn't actually engage much learning value. There's not a lot of language produced. It's just random letters of the alphabet to get one word. If it involves speaking or writing, so that i.e. is a productive activity, how much language does the activity generate? And that's something that, again, observing classes, I found very many classes where the students seem to be engaged and interacting, but when if you listened, there's not very much that's being produced, and certainly not at the level of, like, for example, text or even just sentences. It's a lot of kind of lexical, a lot of words randomly going around. If it involves listening or reading, how much meaningful input is provided and how deeply do the learners need to process it? So there's notion of depth of processing, which seems to be good. The deeper you process something, the more learning opportunities, if you like, it will provide. And then, of course, we can't ignore the affective value of the activity. How engaged and attentive our learners like to be when they do activity? How much participation and or interaction does it involve? Is the activity enjoyable and intrinsically motivating? So notice that our criteria was not fun, but interest, because interest can be cognitive and not necessarily pleasurable. In fact, it's engaging. It attracts our attention. And coming back to Deborah's idea of the TikTok or other ideas you've mentioned, that there is an intrinsic, particularly for the age group, involved intrinsic interest, and therefore, without that, even the best activities in the world are going to fall flat. So those are the first three. Any comments or questions about any of those? There's four more, I'm warning you. Okay, let's move on. Number 4. Okay, I think personally, I mean, as a teacher, and we have limited planning time and whatever, we need activities that we can do with lots of different levels. So, I mean, the point of the running dictation was you can do that with kind of quite low, I mean, obviously you choose the text accordingly, but with quite low level students as well as quite advanced students. So can the activity be applied in a wide range of contexts, including online? Does it lend itself to being adapted to different contexts, to different levels of proficiency and for different purposes? So, and that was a very important criteria when we were putting the book together, because this is not a book just for teachers of young learners. It's not a book for teachers of advanced learners. It's not a book for online teachers. It's meant to cover all those different possible contexts. And then simplicity. I mean, if the activity involves an awful lot of preparation, cutting up pieces of paper and sticking things to card and etc. I mean, come on, life is short. How easy is it to have and to set up too. I mean, if it's very complicated, students don't understand it. And I think, you know, one of the things, it's a bit like when you're cooking recipes. Actually, only yesterday I was looking at a recipe, the cannelloni, Italian cannelloni, and it was so complicated. It had about 5 different stages, and I thought, no way, I couldn't get my head around it. First of all, you got then you got to do this, and then you got to do that, and then you got to roll. No, hang on, there must be an easier way. And then also there's a second, the last question here: how economical is it in terms of the time needed to set it up in relation to the time actually spent doing it? We take 20 minutes to set up, but only 5 minutes to do. That's not a good time on task relation. Spin-off. You know, what follows on from the activity? Does the activity have beneficial consequences beyond immediate language learning in terms, for example, developing learner autonomy, enhancing the motivation of the students, or building a positive classroom climate? And of course, I suppose I would include there too the spin-off as being, you know, what does it lead on to other activities? Does it, you know, if it's a text production activity, can it then become a shared reading activity? And finally, wouldn't fit on the page, but validity, I guess, or validation. How grounded is the activity in theory? I mean, you know, in the end, it would be good to know the activities we choose do have some kind of basis in second language acquisition theory and research, particularly. Is there any research that supports the use of such an activity? Is there evidence, even anecdotal, that the activity has positive learning outcomes? So this is really answering the question, does it work? Which I think is the hardest question to answer, actually. Because just, I mean, you know, but just because a research study here done on those particular students in that particular context produced significant results doesn't mean to say that same activity transferred to my context is going to produce the same results. So we have to be cautious about taking the results of research on board. But at the same time, it's kind of nice to know that this activity has been tested by somebody. Any questions, comments, queries about any of those, or anything I've left off? I did
Do you
write this
think
up.
that
Oh, Deborah,
I'm
go
so
on.
sorry.
No.
Do you think reflecting on all these criteria for tasks is a reflection to Postmethod, as if there is not a one incredible method to be used, so therefore we are constantly reflecting on what we do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the point, really, isn't it? This, coming back to the last session about principled eclecticism. Now, what are the principles that underlie this eclecticism? I mean, one of the things we say in this book, you just don't work through the book, one activity and then do the next one, then the next one, the next one. You've got to be selective because your context is going to be different. So yeah. And something else I was going to say. But you interrupted me, Deborah, and I've forgotten. Oh, I know. I know what I was going to say. I wrote, you don't have to buy the book to get those criteria, because I wrote I'll have to find the link and I'll post it in the follow-up discussion. But in advance of the book's publication, I wrote a blog post for Cambridge, the publishers, which basically said all this. Okay, so we're over the hour. I just want to, I mean, just as an example, share an activity that's not in the book and I didn't invent, but I just love, and many of you will have seen it before, but it's a winner. And it's that. You write up, you put up, you project whatever this template, and you check that they understand the meaning of one of us, one of our group, and you put them into groups of 3 or 4, and they have to generate as many true sentences using that template. And then they will report them to the class. And it seems to me that this kind of ticks so many boxes, because, I mean, apart from its elegant simplicity, it is extremely adaptable, because you can change the structure according to what the structure of the day is. But it's the spin-off in terms of the fact that the students have to do this to get true sentences means that in their groups they have to find things out about each other that they maybe didn't know, and they do this by asking questions. So, you know, if it's can, then, you know, who can play a musical instrument, for example, and of course you can pre-teach some of these question forms, but who can speak several languages, who can drive, who can, etc., cook. And then out of that discussion, the sentences are generated. There's going to be quite a lot of use of the target structure, can, so it's kind of very focused. It's going to inherently repetitive. And any theory of language learning, not just behaviorism, acknowledges the importance of, where they call it repetition or entrenchment or whatever, but you need to keep revisiting the language that you're learning, and in quite accessible chunks. So this generates a lot of sentences. And when you get back to the students reporting those sentences to the class, of course, then there's further repetition and further interest, because, again, they're learning things about their peers that they didn't necessarily know. So it's the volume of, in terms of production, in terms of, you know, the ratio between setting up and the language that it generates is ginormous. And of course, then it has further spin-off, because the teacher can take any one of these sentences they produce, like 3 of us or none of us can play a musical instrument. And then you say, okay, that's interesting. What about this other group? What about, did you have anything about music? Yeah, one of us can play the guitar. Okay, let me guess, which one of you is it? I think, how long have you played the guitar? How did you learn to play it? You people who don't play a musical instrument, did you ever study one? Did you ever want to play music, etc. Massive amount of opportunities for conversation that develops out of these true sentences. And as I say, it's adaptable to any grammatical structure, and you can do it online. Students go into breakout rooms and generate all the sentences, and they come back and report on them. So, I mean, it seems to me to be so elegant and so simple, and yet so productive, that it's definitely one of my favorite. And I'm sorry for those of you who've seen me talk about it before, and I wish I had invented it. Nobody knows who did, although people tend to think it might have been Mario Rinvolucri, the very recently deceased Mario Rinvolucri, who produced some stunning activities, and has got some in this book, incidentally, because he wrote several books in that series. So that's the kind of thing I mean. Yeah, should I say?
Two things. Wonderful activity. Yes, I had seen you talk about it before, and I fell in love with it. But I would like to make, before we call it a day, I would like to make 2 comments. It seems to me that when I was reading the chapter, and after reading all the other chapters, I haven't read chapter 6 yet. It seems that Hall is implicitly telling us that, especially I had this feeling in this chapter, that there are some common threads
Mhm.
in all of the methods or these approaches, and that's what maybe we as teachers and teacher trainers have to know and to show that these threads, I mean, we have to somehow intertwine them according to context. That's the feeling I'm getting, and I'm actually expressing it to know if I'm going in the right direction in terms of understanding Graham Hall's maybe purpose or even stance in about all this. And the second thing is, we don't have to check it now because maybe not all of you have the book right there with you. On page 139, either I didn't understand it or there's a mistake.
Oh, yeah. Oh.
In the second paragraph, more or less in the middle,
Mhm.
when he talks about the output hypotheses, then there is this sentence, which is a very long one anyway, consequently suggests that producing language requires more mental effort and is more challenging than simply understanding input. And then the next sentence, and that learning results from output rather than output.
No. Yeah, it's the punctuation. He says that learning results from output rather than output being just a consequence of learning. So he's saying that learning results from output. It's not that output is the consequence of, like, you learn all the grammar and you learn the vocabulary and then you produce language. No, output is the means of learning the language. You learn through output. You learn through production.
Yeah,
It's
when I
not
was
the
reading and I
goal
read
of.
it fast, I thought it was
It's an
learning results
awkwardly.
from output rather than input.
Yeah. No. It's an awkwardly phrased sentence, but there is a mistake. Actually, there is an actual mistake. I thought that's what you were going to draw attention to in the chapter when he uses, yes, on page 132, he's talking about behaviorism at the bottom of the page, and he says, behaviorism suggests that learning is essentially a process in which learners are conditioned to respond to specific stimuli in particular ways, with correct responses reinforced, so that desired behaviors eventually become, he says, voluntary and automatic. He means involuntary and automatic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that we don't have to think about them. They're they're involuntary. That's what automatic means. So there's a tiny little mistake there that kind of caught my attention. So we'll tell Graham next edition, yeah, could he sort that out and repunctuate that sentence, which is ambiguous.
Thank you.
Good. Okay. Anything else you want to offer or ask about? I mean, I'm not going to get to my plan B, obviously, which I'll have to do next week in the final session. But anything else you would like to throw into the pot? Or any other activities that you want to share? Some of you will know from previous courses that I'm a great fan of a very short list of 5 criteria for fluency activities, first proposed in a TESOL quarterly article way back in the late 80s or early 90s by 2 Canadian researchers called Gat Bonton and Segelowitz. And James, I bet you have this in your archive somewhere. We've used it before. But what they were attempting to do was, in a sense, cross the bridge from audiolingual approaches, which had been the reigning method in a sense up until the communicative approach, but there was quite a lot of crossover. And they could see and sense that there were certain activities associated with audiolingualism which were essentially okay and should not be suddenly, just because they were associated with audiolingualism, they should not be consigned to the rubbish, the trash can. Particularly those that involve some degree of repetition. So we remember audiolingualism, you don't, but I do, as being all about repetition. Drill, 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 and get it right. And then once you've got it right, we'll allow you to move into kind of being more creative with the language. But you have to get it right first. And the only way to do that is to repeat, 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 repeat. Now, Gatbonton and Segal said, yeah, okay, it's not about just drilling, but nevertheless, there are aspects of that kind of controlled practice which seem to be important in terms of achieving fluency or creativity with the language, ultimately. And I guess that's what I wanted to look at in my plan B, but we don't have time to. But James, you just posted that link, did you?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
It's well worth looking at their 5 criteria and how they explain them. And they call them criteria for is it creative fluency, something like that. And one of them is
it's creative automatization, right?
Creative automatization, exactly. So you want to get automatic with the language, but you also want to be creative with it. And the problem with the audiolingual approach and all this drilling is it's got you automatic, maybe, but you didn't necessarily move into creativity. So how can you bridge, that audiolingual kind of approach with a more communicative, creative view of language? And they had some really interesting, these 5 criteria just to me, seem to me to be really, even though they've been around for a long time, that they seem to be validated by all the research subsequently. And one of them is about the psychological, what they call, I think, psychological authenticity, that you need to create the conditions whereby it feels like you're using the language as if you were using it outside the classroom. So certain tasks in the classroom, you need to replicate the condition of psychological authenticity, which sometimes with language production can be quite stressful in the real world, when it's not always about talking about nice things and being nice to each other. Sometimes you have to argue, and sometimes you have to persuade people, etc., and all this can be face-threatening. It doesn't mean to say that activities in the classroom should be always or even often threatening, but it does mean that activities at a certain stage should replicate some of the characteristics of real life conversation, which includes things like unpredictability, not knowing what the other person's going to say. It includes things like using other resources apart from language to get your meaning across, through gesture, through use of the L1 if need be, etc. Using what I call communication strategies to get your meaning across, and so on. Strategic use of language. So I don't want to go through the list, but it is a very short list. Look at that article. But it seems to me that these criteria for fluency activities still have a lot of, to me, plausibility. And I would certainly recommend looking at that. So yet another list, a way of measuring the value of some of the things we do in the classroom. So going back to something like Hangman, does it tick any of the boxes in that list, and I think probably not. Hugh, do you want to elaborate on that point you've just put into the chat? And we haven't heard from you today. We can't hear you now.
Got to get my microphone back on and okay, yeah. Well, I mean, even for me, Hangman, sometimes with private students or sometimes in a small setting, it can be a sort of stepping stone to raising awareness about pronunciation, or with a beginning learner, sound spelling, the differences in the sound system of Japanese and English so profoundly challenging to Japanese learners. So anything that you can make fun and do in little bits and add to other activities, whether that would be dictation or even, as you were saying before, the bridge from audiolingual to something more effective. And I mean, when I think about Sonny Rollins practicing scales, I would say a possible example of that in language would be reading aloud and just going slow. And as a great lover of poetry and song, rereading poems or the lyrics of songs aloud allows you to see the poem in a new way. And that, I don't know, new point of view is one of the most important aspects of any kind of learning, I would say.
Absolutely. I mean, I could still remember poems I learned by heart in German when I was studying at secondary school. I'm not going to embarrass myself in front of James or Pam Duck.
Do it. No, just kidding.
Weh mir, wo nehme ich, wenn es Winter ist, die Blumen und wo den Sonnenschein.
So that's good. That's good.
That was autonomous learning avant la lettre, because I was interested in literature at the time, and a whole new language offered a whole new literature. And the local library, public library, had the inspiration, had the inspiration of having long playing records, which you could rent out as well as books. So I rented out a long playing record of German poetry, read, very histrionically by great voices. And by dint of just listening to that again and again and again, and reading the poems themselves while I listened, these became imprinted on my mind. And you see, memorized chunks of language like that, as you suggest, Hugh, provide a kind of template will give you a feel for the syntax, particularly of the language. And German syntax, as we all know, is kind of bizarre and extreme. But if you learn big chunks of German, you get the syntax for free. And so absolutely, I totally agree with you, Hugh. I mean, we can't force learners into down avenues that they're not. I mean, I think this is why what Deborah's talking about with the TikTok, or Saba with the song lyrics. Yes, I mean, that's the equivalent for students who are not quite as nerdy as I was when I was 15 or 16, reading 19th century German poetry. I mean, get a life. Okay, folks, on that note.
That's something interesting about you. I love
Yes, but Scott, you
Always
said
good-
that
always a-
reading a lot for pleasure is probably
Yes.
not the best source, but combining it with listening to the same text, so we can, and this sentence, it might be more useful. So there are audiobooks,
Absolutely.
thousands of audiobooks available in a language, and then you can read them and listen, and it might be much more helpful.
Exactly. Going back to Hugh's point about having students read aloud, I think the teacher reading aloud poetry, or anything, but poetry particularly, you need to hear poetry because it's written to be heard as much as to be read. And I remember once I was observing a class, and it was an advanced class, and they were studying a poem by D.H. Lawrence, which I actually knew and liked. And the teacher, well, I can't remember whether I volunteered. I was observing. I mean, I was there to observe the teacher, but I said, would you like me to read it? Or she asked me, I can't remember. And I read it aloud, and you could see how engaged the students were to hear it. Suddenly, reading aloud by somebody who knows how to read aloud really breaks it up into its meaningful sections, and you can add expression, etc., and make it dramatic. And poetry is wonderful for that. Not all poetry, but a lot of poetry. So yeah, Hugh, I totally support that.
One more little story. So when I was in junior high in Washington, D.C., eons ago, we had a fairly demanding English program, and we were reading Shakespeare in first year of middle school, and I found it really difficult at first to understand the chunks. But somehow I had an instinct that if I could listen to the plays, that maybe I would be able to feel my way into grammatical understanding. So I went to the public library, checked out the plays on LPs, and then listened and read along with the recorded version of the play, and it opened up Shakespeare to me in a wonderful, easy way. And that was great.
Absolutely.
So I try to
Lovely,
tell that
fantastic.
story to my students and say, yeah, we have to, get there through the ear and through the body.
Absolutely, absolutely, and through the emotions too. Brilliant, and there's lots of lovely links flying around here too. So if you haven't got a chance to catch those now, they'll be in the transcript of the. I think you get it when you get the recording, you get the chat. No.
Yes, I
Okay,
think so.
folks. One more session next week, and final chapter, and a sort of wrap up. So any lingering questions and concerns and ideas, please bring them to the session. And meanwhile, of course, we'll have the two discussions running, the reflective one and the prospective one. I'll be opening those shortly. So that's about it. So great to see you all again. Thank you for your contributions, and see you next week. Have a great week.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.